Maggie Willard threw herself in front of the man's horse with both arms spread wide, her voice cracking open like dry earth in a drought. "You will not take my child. You hear me? You will not." The whole town watched. Nobody moved. That summer in Millstone Creek, a mother's scream and a stranger's silence would collide in a way no one ever forgot. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, subscribe and follow till the very end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 arrived in Millstone Creek the way most bad things did, quietly, and then all at once. The heat came first. It pressed down on the main street like a hand on a neck heavy and unrelenting, turning the packed dirt the color of old bone. By mid-July, the creek itself had shrunk to a thin whisper of water between cracked banks, and the cottonwood trees stood motionless, their silver leaves hanging limp in air that refused to move. Horses tied at the rail outside Caldwell's general store stood with their heads low. Dogs didn't bother barking anymore. Even the flies seemed too tired to care. It was in that kind of heat, the kind that strips a person down to whatever they're made of, that Maggie Willard walked into town for the last time as a free woman. She walked fast. Not because she was late, but because she was afraid that if she slowed down, she would stop altogether and never start again. She wore her dead husband's old canvas jacket. Despite the heat, the sleeves rolled to her elbows because the jacket had two deep pockets, and in the left one, she had folded every dollar bill and coin she had left in the world. She had counted it 4 times that morning, sitting at the kitchen table while Annie slept. The number hadn't changed. $41.30. Thaddeus Carter was owed $380. Annie walked beside her, 7 years old, and already too aware of things a child had no business understanding. She held her mother's hand with both of hers and didn't ask questions. That was the part that hurt Maggie most, that her daughter had learned not to ask questions. "Mama," Annie said softly, "are we going to be all right?" Maggie squeezed her hand. "We're going to walk in there and talk to Mr. Carter like civilized people." "That ain't what I asked." Maggie looked down at her daughter. 7 years old. Dark hair, her father's eyes. Too sharp for her own good. "I know it ain't," Maggie said. "Keep walking." Thaddeus Carter's office occupied the largest building on Millstone Creek's main street, a 2-story structure of dark timber and glass that managed to look both impressive and suffocating at the same time. His name was painted above the door in gold letters that had begun to peel at the edges, which Maggie had always thought was fitting. Everything about Thaddeus Carter looked perfect from a distance and showed its rot up close. He was already standing at the window when they arrived, as if he'd been watching for her. That was his way, making sure you knew he'd seen you before you'd seen him. The man who opened the door for them wasn't Carter himself, but his man Doyle Pruitt, a thin-faced fellow with cold eyes and the kind of stillness that reminded Maggie of a snake before it struck. He looked at Maggie, then down at Annie, then back at Maggie, and said nothing, just stepped aside. Carter was seated behind his desk when they entered. Though he rose when Maggie walked in, not out of courtesy she knew, but because standing made him taller, and Carter was a man who needed every advantage he could manufacture. He was well dressed for a Tuesday morning in a town like this, his black coat pressed and buttoned, despite the heat, his silver watch chain catching the light from the window. "Mrs. Willard." He said it like the words had a taste he wasn't sure he liked. "I expected you yesterday." "I was getting your money together," Maggie said. She kept her voice steady. She'd practiced keeping it steady all the way from the farm. "That takes time." "It takes time when there isn't enough of it." Carter moved around the desk unhurried and stopped in front of Annie. He looked down at the child the way a man looks at livestock he's considering buying. "Hello, little one." Annie stared straight ahead and said nothing. Carter smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "Smart child. She gets that from her daddy, I'd wager. Not from his business sense, God rest him." He glanced at Maggie. "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Willard, but a poor judge of numbers." "My husband trusted the wrong people," Maggie said. "That was his mistake, and I intend to correct it." She reached into her pocket and placed the folded bills on the edge of his desk. $41.30. She'd even smoothed out the crumpled ones. Carter looked at the money. He didn't touch it. "That's $41, he said, and 30 cents. I'm owed $380. I know what you're owed," Maggie said. "I'm asking for more time. 3 months. I can work the south field through the harvest, sell the crop, and have the rest by October. I give you my word." Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he walked back to his chair and sat down, and the way he sat, slow, deliberate, completely at ease, told Maggie everything she needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. "Mrs. Willard," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "I've been extending you patience for 8 months. I gave you time after Thomas died. I gave you time through the winter. I gave you time through the spring. And now it is July, and you come to me with $41.30 and a promise." He shook his head slowly. "I am a businessman, ma'am, not a charity." "Then behave like a businessman," Maggie said. "A harvest deal is sound business. You'd clear full interest on—" "The property transfers to my ownership on Friday," Carter said, as if she hadn't spoken. "Per the terms of the original loan agreement, the land, the structures, and all livestock." Maggie's chest went tight. "You said—" "I said what I said 8 months ago." His voice was pleasant, almost gentle. "The agreement was clear. Thomas signed it. You witnessed it. I have the papers. Thomas signed it because he didn't understand what he was signing." She heard her voice sharpen and couldn't stop it. "You knew he was sick. You knew he was scared. You handed him a pen and a promise, and he trusted you." "That is a very serious accusation, Mrs. Willard." "It's a very serious truth, Mr. Carter." The room went still. Doyle Pruitt shifted near the door. Carter studied Maggie for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He smiled again, wider this time, and leaned back in his chair like a man who had just been handed a gift. "You've got spirit," he said. "I'll grant you that. Thomas always said so. Said you were the toughest woman he'd ever known." The smile faded. "But spirit doesn't pay a debt, Mrs. Willard. Friday is Friday." Maggie held her ground. "And Annie," Carter tilted his head. "Pardon." "My daughter, when you take the farm, where does she go? Where do we go?" Something crossed Carter's face then. Not guilt. She didn't think he was capable of guilt, but something more like mild inconvenience. He opened a drawer and removed a folded piece of paper, setting it on the desk between them. "There are arrangements," he said. "The county has a home for children in Larimer, run by decent people." Maggie felt the floor shift under her feet. "You're not serious," she whispered. "The farm cannot support the two of you without the land and income," Carter said, his voice taking on the careful tone of a man explaining something to someone he considered slow. "And you, Mrs. Willard, are a young widow without income, without property, and without prospects. You cannot provide for a child. She is my child. And the law," Carter said quietly, "is not sentimental." Maggie did not remember walking out of Carter's office. She remembered the door and the heat of the street hitting her face like an open hand, and Annie's fingers tightening around hers, and the sound of her own breath coming too fast, too shallow. She walked until her legs stopped at the edge of the water trough in front of the general store, and she stood there and stared at her reflection in the still hot water and tried to think. 3 days. She had 3 days. "Mama." Annie's voice was very small. "What did he say? Nothing we can't fix." The lie came out of her mouth before she could stop it. She hated herself for it immediately. "Mama." Annie pulled on her hand until Maggie looked down at her. "I heard him say Larimer." Maggie crouched down to her daughter's level, right there in the middle of the street in the full heat of the July sun, with half the town probably watching. She put both hands on Annie's face. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. "You are not going to Larimer. Do you understand me? Not as long as I am breathing." Annie's dark eyes searched hers. "Promise?" "I promise you on your daddy's grave." Annie nodded once solemnly. Okay, Mama. Maggie stood back up. Her legs felt like they were made of something unreliable, but they held. She turned and looked down the length of Millstone Creek's main street. The saloon, the barber shop, the lawyer's office that belonged to Carter's brother-in-law. The jail, where Sheriff Holt had made it his business to stay out of Carter's affairs for the last 4 years, and she felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet. Just the hard, cold certainty that she was not done fighting. She just didn't know yet what she was fighting with. It was old Ruth Henderson who found her standing there 20 minutes later, still looking down the street at nothing in particular, Annie pressed against her side. Ruth Henderson was 63 years old, wide in the hips, and narrow in the mouth when it came to other people's business. But she had always had a soft spot for Maggie Willard, and she showed it now by appearing at Maggie's elbow with a cup of cold water and the sort of expression that said, "I already know, and I'm not going to pretend I don't." "He said Friday," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Friday," Maggie confirmed. Ruth handed her the water. Maggie drank it without tasting it. "Bill went to see Judge Alcott last spring," Ruth said. "After Carter tried to pull that business with the Donovan grazing rights. Judge Alcott told him there wasn't anything to be done. Said the contracts were solid." She paused. "Carter writes his contracts solid. That's the one thing he's good at." "I know. You got anywhere to go? Any family?" "My sister's in Denver, but she's got 4 of her own and a husband who—" Maggie stopped. No, I don't have anywhere to go." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, like she was mentioning the weather, "There's a man been staying at the Millstone Inn since Thursday." Maggie looked at her. "I don't follow." "Big fella, quiet. Keeps to himself mostly. Eats alone, doesn't cause trouble. Ed at the stable says he paid cash for his horse's board for 2 weeks, so he ain't just passing through." Ruth glanced sideways at Maggie. "Nobody knows his name. Came in from the north. Has the look of a man who's worked cattle most of his life, but there's something—" She shook her head. "I don't know. Ed says he carries himself different." Maggie frowned. "Ruth, I don't see what—" "He was in the hardware store yesterday when Doyle Pruitt came in bragging about the Willard farm transfer." Ruth's voice dropped lower. "Margaret, I was 2 shelves over from that man. I heard him go still, like a person goes still when something hits too close to home." She met Maggie's eyes. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying." Maggie looked at her for a long moment, then looked away. "I'm not in a position to put hope in a stranger." "No." Ruth agreed. "You're not." She patted Maggie's arm. "But the Lord does work in peculiar ways, and it is an awful big coincidence for a quiet stranger to ride into Millstone Creek the same week Thaddeus Carter decides to make his move on a widow and her little girl." She walked away before Maggie could answer, leaving her standing in the heat with an empty cup and the strange, unsettling feeling of a door she hadn't known was there. Jake Benton had not intended to stay in Millstone Creek. He'd intended to ride through same as he'd ridden through a dozen towns in the 18 months since he'd walked away from the Bar C Ranch in Wyoming with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a man after he's done something he can't undo. He hadn't done anything criminal. He needed to be clear about that, at least to himself, even if he never said it to another living person. What he'd done was fail. He'd failed his foreman Hector when Hector's family had been pushed off their land by men with money and legal papers, and a sheriff willing to look the other way. Jake had stood right there and watched it happen and done nothing because he'd had a job to keep and a debt of his own to pay, and he'd told himself it wasn't his fight. Hector had looked at him as they took his family away, and Jake had looked back, and neither of them had said a word. That look had followed Jake south through Wyoming and Colorado and into this small, sun-baked piece of New Mexico that called itself Millstone Creek. He'd meant to stay 2 nights. Water the horse, resupply, move on. Then he'd walked into Henderson's hardware to pick up a box of ammunition, and he'd heard Doyle Pruitt's voice carrying from the next aisle over high and self-satisfied. "Carter's getting the Willard place Friday. $380 against a widow who can barely keep the field planted. She'll put up a fuss sure enough, and then she'll fold like they all do. Got a little girl, too. County'll sort that out." Jake had stood very still. He'd bought his ammunition. He'd walked back to the inn. He'd sat on the edge of his bed for a long time staring at the wall. Then he'd asked the innkeeper, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Alcott, who the Willard widow was. Then he first saw Maggie Willard the following morning. He'd been walking back from the livery when he passed the general store and saw her standing on the boardwalk with a little girl pressed close to her side, and an expression on her face that he recognized from the mirror, the expression of a person standing at the edge of something. They cannot cross alone, trying to look like they're not afraid. She was younger than he'd expected. 30, maybe 32. She had dark hair pulled back tight at the nape of her neck, and her dress was clean despite being worn at the elbows, and she held herself straight in a way that looked like it was costing her something. The little girl had her mother's jaw and her mother's way of standing, as if someone had asked her if she was scared, and she had decided the honest answer was not acceptable. Jake walked past them. He didn't say anything. He wasn't ready to say anything yet. But he turned at the corner and stood in the shadow of the post and watched Maggie Willard take her daughter's hand and walk back toward the edge of town, her back straight and her head high, and something settled in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. He hadn't stopped Pruitt that day in the hardware store. He'd let Hector go without a word. He'd spent a year and a half riding away from things that needed a man to stop and stand still. Jake Benton leaned against the post in the shadow of the building and watched the widow with the straight back and the 7-year-old daughter who didn't ask questions, and he thought, not this time. That afternoon, he went to see Ruth Henderson. He'd heard her name mentioned at the inn and figured anyone who'd lived in a town 20 years and kept a straight face while doing it knew where all the pieces sat on the board. He found her in the back of the hardware store, cataloging a new shipment of nails, and he stepped to the counter and said quietly, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. I was wondering if I could ask you about a woman named Willard." Ruth Henderson looked up at him with small, sharp eyes and did not seem particularly surprised to see him. "I know who you are," she said, "or who you might be. You're the quiet one from the inn. Jake Benton, ma'am." "You asking about Maggie Willard out of curiosity or out of purpose?" Jake held her gaze. "Out of purpose." Ruth set down her clipboard. She looked at him for a long measuring moment, the kind of look women who'd been alive a long time gave to men they were deciding whether to trust. "You got any money?" she asked. "Some." "More than $41. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth Henderson picked her clipboard back up, made a small mark on her sheet, and said without looking at him, "She'll be at the farm in the morning. Ain't nowhere else she's got to be." She paused. "Gate's about 2 miles east of town. You can't miss it. It's the one that needs a new hinge and has a red rag tied on the post because the latch sticks." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me," Ruth said briskly. "Thank me by not being another man who says the right thing and then rides off when it gets difficult." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." He walked out into the summer heat. Behind him, Ruth Henderson watched him go, and for the first time in a week, she allowed herself to feel something that wasn't entirely hopeless. Maggie was in the yard at first light, working the soil around the base of the cornstalks with the same rhythm she'd used every morning for the past 6 years, because rhythm was the only thing that held a person upright when everything else was tilting sideways. Annie was still asleep in the house. The morning was already warm, the kind of warm that promised a brutal afternoon, and the air smelled of dry earth and somewhere far off cattle. She heard the horse before she saw it. She straightened and turned and watched a rider come up the road to the gate. Big man, dark horse. The kind of quiet that comes from a man who has decided what he's going to do and is not in the habit of second-guessing it. He stopped at the gate. He looked at the red rag on the post, then lifted the latch with the practiced ease of someone who'd been told about it. He rode to the fence line and stopped again. He did not dismount yet. He just looked at her. Maggie looked back. "Mrs. Willard," he said. "Who's asking?" "Name's Jake Benton. I've been staying in town." He held her gaze steadily. "I heard about your situation. I was hoping you'd be willing to talk." Maggie's grip tightened on the handle of her hoe. "I've done enough talking with strangers this week." "Yes, ma'am, I imagine you have." He paused. "I'm not here to offer you words." Another pause, careful and deliberate. "I'm here because I made a mistake once. Stood by and watched something happen that I could have stopped and I didn't, and I've been carrying that a long time now." His jaw was tight. "I don't know you, Mrs. Willard, but I know Thaddeus Carter's kind. And I know what it looks like when a woman's run out a road, and the only thing standing between her daughter and a county home is $41 and whatever's left of her will." Maggie stared at him. The sun had just cleared the eastern ridge, and the light came across the field in long, flat bars of gold, and the morning was very quiet. "How do you know about the $41? She asked. "Small town," he said. "And the walls in Carter's office aren't as thick as he thinks." She looked at him for a long moment. Studied the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins, the steadiness in his eyes that was different from the blankness of a man who felt nothing. It was the steadiness of a man who felt everything and had learned at great personal cost how to hold it still. "You'd better get down off that horse," Maggie said finally, "and say whatever you came to say to my face." Jake Benton swung down from the saddle. He pulled his hat off and held it at his side, and he looked at her across 10 feet of dry summer ground, and he said, "I want to help. I'm asking you to let me." The corn stood tall and silent around them. Annie's voice came from the house, a soft, sleepy sound, and Maggie's eyes flicked toward the door and back. She did not say yes. Not yet. But she did not say no. And in Millstone Creek, in the summer of 1883, not saying no was sometimes the bravest thing a woman could do. Jake Benton stood on the other side of that fence line, with his hat in his hand, and his eyes steady, and his offer hanging in the dry morning air between them and Maggie Willard, did the one thing she had promised herself she would never do in front of a stranger. She almost cried, not from weakness. From the sheer staggering weight of someone offering to help after 8 months of carrying everything alone. She caught it before it came, pressed her lips together, and looked past his left shoulder at the line of corn, and breathed slow and even until the feeling passed, and when she looked back at him, her face was composed again, if a little too tight around the jaw. "What exactly," she said, "does help look like to you, Mr. Benton?" He didn't rush the answer. She appreciated that. Men who rushed answers were men who hadn't thought the question all the way through. "First," he said, "it looks like me sitting at your kitchen table and hearing the whole of it, the debt, the papers, the timeline." He turned his hat slowly in his hands once around. "Then we figure out what can actually be done. And if nothing can be done, then we'll know that too." He met her eyes. "But I don't think that's where we're going to land." Maggie studied him another moment. Then she turned and walked toward the house, and she said over her shoulder, without looking back, "Coffee's on the stove. Wipe your boots." He sat across from her at the kitchen table with a chipped mug of coffee he didn't touch, and he listened. That was what struck her first, that he listened the way people almost never did, without filling the silence with reassurances or opinions, without the little noises of sympathy that usually meant a person was waiting for their turn to speak. He just sat there with his big hands wrapped around the mug and listened while she laid it all out flat. Thomas's illness, the loan, the fine print Carter had slid in under the fever-blurred signature of a dying man, the 8 months of scrambling, the $41 Friday. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Annie had come out of the bedroom while Maggie was talking, seen the stranger at the table, and stopped. Jake had looked at her, not the way Carter looked at her, like she was a problem to be sorted, but with the kind of direct, respectful attention adults rarely gave children, like she was a person worth acknowledging. "Morning," he'd said to Annie simply. Annie had blinked. "Morning," she'd said back. Then she'd climbed into the chair beside her mother and sat there with her chin on her hands listening too. Now Jake said, "Can I see the loan papers?" Maggie got up without a word, pulled a tin box down from the shelf above the door, and set it in front of him. He opened it and took out the folded document inside. He read it the way a careful man reads something he knows might be trying to fool him, slow from the top, not jumping to the numbers first. His jaw tightened once. "Here," he said, and set the paper flat and tapped a clause near the bottom. This language. In the event of default, all collateral transfers to the lender in full, including but not limited to all structures, improvements, livestock, and any secondary parties occupying the property at time of transfer. Maggie leaned over. "I saw that. Carter's man Pruitt told me it just meant the land and buildings." "It doesn't just mean the land and buildings." Jake's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. "Secondary parties. That's you. That's Annie. Carter could make a legal argument that by accepting this, Thomas agreed to—" He stopped, set the paper down. "This is not a standard loan agreement." "I know that now," Maggie said. She kept her voice flat. If she let herself feel how angry she was, she wouldn't be able to stop. "I didn't know it when Thomas signed it." Jake was quiet. He folded the paper along its original creases and set it back in the box carefully. Then he said, "Do you know a man named Samuel Pruitt? Older fella used to practice law over in Colfax County?" Maggie frowned. "I don't think so. Doyle Pruitt's uncle. He and Carter had a falling out about 4 years back, something about a land deal that went sideways. He's been living quiet since, but he's got knowledge of how Carter operates. If those papers have a flaw—" Jake paused. "Carter's good at what he does, but even the best-built trap has a weak joint somewhere if you know where to look." Annie said from her spot at the table, "Can you find the weak joint?" They both looked at her. "Maybe," Jake said to Annie with a seriousness he clearly felt she deserved. "That's what I'm going to try." Annie considered this. "Okay," she said. She picked up her spoon and went back to her oatmeal, like the matter was settled. Jake rode back toward town with something he hadn't carried in 18 months, a direction. He went first to the inn where he sat at the small desk in his room and wrote out every detail of the loan agreement from memory. Every clause, every piece of language that didn't sit right. He'd spent 5 years on a ranch owned by a man who'd nearly lost everything to a fraudulent contract, and in that time, he'd learned more about the architecture of legal documents than most cowboys ever needed to know. What Carter had given Thomas Willard to sign was not a simple loan. It was a constructed mechanism. It had been built to fail. The question was whether it had been built well enough to hold. He went next to the barber. Not for a haircut, though. The barber, a narrow man named Ike Colby, gave him one anyway and charged him a fair price. But because in a town this size, a barber heard more than anyone except maybe a bartender. And Jake needed to understand the topography of what he was walking into. He let Ike talk. He asked 2 questions. He left 20 minutes later with the name of the one man in Millstone Creek who had reason to want Thaddeus Carter's contracts looked at sideways. He also left with the knowledge that Carter had already dispatched Doyle Pruitt to the county seat to file the transfer paperwork. That meant Friday wasn't certain. Friday might be as early as tomorrow afternoon. Jake walked faster. He found Doc Emmett Briggs not at his office but at the back table of the Silver Rail Saloon, nursing a glass of something amber and reading a newspaper with the particular concentration of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't thinking about something that was troubling him considerably. Emmett Briggs was 61 years old, had practiced medicine in Millstone Creek for 19 years, and had also, according to Ike, the barber, been the one who'd sat at Thomas Willard's bedside in the final weeks, and had tried quietly and unsuccessfully to convince Carter to delay the loan pressure while his patient was dying. Carter had declined. Briggs had not forgotten. Jake sat down across from him without being invited and said quietly, "I need to know what you remember about Thomas Willard's condition when he signed Carter's loan papers." Briggs put down his newspaper. He looked at Jake with sharp, tired eyes. "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who's trying to help his widow keep her farm and her daughter." Briggs was quiet. Then he picked up his glass and drank slowly, and Jake waited. "Thomas Willard," Briggs said, finally setting the glass down, "was running a fever of 103 degrees the day those papers were signed. I know, because I was there 2 hours before, and I came back 2 hours after, and his temperature had not moved. His voice was careful. I also know that he asked me afterward what he had signed. He said Carter's man had explained it to him, but that his head wasn't clear, and he couldn't quite follow the words. Jake felt something solidify in his chest. Would you say that in front of a judge? Briggs looked at him for a long moment. I've been asking myself that question for 8 months, he said. And? The doctor folded his newspaper. He set it aside. He straightened in his chair with the slow deliberateness of a man putting on armor. Yes, Emmett Briggs said. I believe I would. The word got around Millstone Creek, the way words always did in small towns, sideways, through back doors, across fence lines, inside the careful, ordinary sentences of people who knew how to talk about one thing while meaning another. By mid-afternoon, Ruth Henderson knew. By supper time, so did the liveryman Ed and the woman who ran the laundry, and 3 of the families who'd been farming the Eastern Valley for 15 years. They all knew a stranger had ridden out to the Willard farm that morning. They all knew he'd spent 2 hours at the barber and the saloon asking questions. And they all knew Doyle Pruitt had been watching. Jake was walking back toward the inn when Pruitt stepped out of the alley beside the feed store and fell into step beside him close enough that their shoulders almost touched the kind of proximity that was meant as a message. Mr. Benton, Pruitt said pleasantly. Nice afternoon. It is, Jake agreed. He didn't slow down or speed up. You've been making a lot of friends today. I'm a friendly man. Pruitt smiled with his mouth only. Word of advice from one traveler to another, Millstone Creek is a good town. Peaceful. Settled. People here have their arrangements, and those arrangements work because everybody understands their place in them. He paused. Folks who come through and start pulling at threads they don't understand well, sometimes they find out the fabric unravels in ways they didn't plan for. Jake stopped walking. He turned and looked at Pruitt fully for the first time, and Pruitt, to his credit, held the look. Though something in his eyes shifted in a way he probably didn't mean to show. I appreciate the advice, Jake said. His voice was even and quiet. Now let me offer you some in return. He let a beat of silence land. I've been in this territory a long time, and I've met a lot of men who work for men like Carter. You know what I've noticed? Pruitt said nothing. When the whole thing comes down, Jake said, and it always comes down, the man who actually built it walks away clean, and the man who was fetching and carrying for him gets buried in whatever's left. He held Pruitt's gaze another moment. Think on that. He turned and kept walking. Behind him, Doyle Pruitt stood in the middle of the street, and the pleasant expression on his face had gone somewhere else entirely. That evening, Jake rode back out to the Willard farm. He didn't plan to stay. He'd told himself he was just going to report what he'd found Briggs's testimony, the possibility of a legal challenge based on Thomas's mental state at signing the time pressure of Pruitt's filing. He'd tell her what he knew and let her decide what to do with it. That was the plan. The plan lasted until he turned through the gate and saw Maggie Willard sitting on the front step of the porch with Annie asleep across her lap, the child's hair loose and dark against her mother's dress, and Maggie's face in the last hour of daylight carrying an expression that she clearly thought no one was around to see. He'd seen that expression before. He'd seen it in the mirror in the months after Wyoming. It was the look of someone who was holding it together with both hands and wasn't sure how much longer their grip would hold. He dismounted quietly and tied the horse at the fence post and walked to the edge of the porch and stopped. Maggie looked up. She didn't startle, which told him she'd heard him coming. She also didn't move to shift Annie or compose her expression, which told him something else, that she was either too tired to bother or that she'd decided somewhere in the course of this very long day to stop pretending in front of him. Find anything, she said low, so she didn't wake Annie. Some things, he said. He settled onto the top step a careful distance away and kept his voice low to match. Briggs will talk. He remembers everything about Thomas's condition the day he signed. That's something. Maggie's eyes closed for just a moment. Is it enough? I don't know yet. I need to get to Samuel Pruitt before Carter finds out what I'm doing. He paused. There's also the matter of time. Doyle Pruitt was at the county seat today. Filing can move faster than— I know. Her voice was very quiet. I know. They were silent for a while. A night bird called from somewhere in the dark field. Why are you doing this? Maggie asked. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking out at the dark. Don't tell me what you told me this morning. Tell me the real reason. Jake was quiet. There was a man, he said finally, named Hector. He worked alongside me at a ranch in Wyoming. Good man, honest man. Had a wife and 2 boys and a piece of leased land he'd been working for 11 years. He stopped, started again. Someone with money decided they wanted that land. They had papers, they had a lawyer, they had a judge who owed them favors. He looked down at his hands. And I had a job I didn't want to lose, and a debt I was still paying, and I told myself it wasn't my fight. Maggie was listening. I watched them load Hector's family into a wagon, Jake said. His youngest was about Annie's age. He looked back at me from the wagon. Just looked. He let the silence sit. I quit the next day. Been moving south ever since, looking for I don't know what I was looking for. A place where I didn't see that boy's face. He exhaled. I reckon maybe there's no such place. Maybe the only way out is through. Maggie was quiet for a long time. Annie shifted in her sleep, murmured something, and was still again. Thomas was a good man, Maggie said softly. Not a strong man, but a good one. He trusted people because he thought most people were worth trusting. Her voice didn't break, but it came close. He would have liked you, I think. He would have offered you supper and talked your ear off about crop rotation. She almost smiled. He liked men who listened. Jake looked at her. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away. Don't make me a promise you can't keep, Mr. Benton. I've got a daughter sleeping in my lap who believes when I say things will be all right. I can afford exactly one person lying to me, and that person is me. I'm not going to promise you the outcome, Jake said. But I'll promise you this, whatever happens, I won't disappear. I won't ride off when it gets difficult. He paused. That's the only promise I've got left that's worth a damn, and I mean to keep it. Maggie looked at him for a long, careful moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, the same solemn nod Annie had given that morning, and the resemblance was so sudden and so complete that Jake felt something in his chest shift sideways. All right, Maggie said. Then we'd better figure out what we're going to do by Thursday night. What they did not know, what neither of them could have known, sitting in the dark with a sleeping child between them and the whole weight of Friday pressing down, was that Thaddeus Carter had already received a message. Not from Doyle Pruitt. Pruitt's report came later. The message came from the county clerk's office, in the form of a brief note delivered to Carter's door at 7:30 that evening. It informed him that a man named Jake Benton had visited the office that afternoon and requested copies of all public land records pertaining to properties currently held as loan collateral in Millstone Creek. Carter read the note twice. Then he poured himself a drink, which he almost never did, and stood at his window in the dark and looked out at his town and thought. He had not survived 30 years of business in the territories by being surprised by things he should have seen coming. He had not built what he'd built in Millstone Creek by losing when losing could be prevented by a sufficiently early and sufficiently decisive action. He had made mistakes before, yes, but he'd made them early and corrected them before they had time to become problems. This stranger, this Jake Benton, had arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Or from his perspective, exactly the right one. Carter set down his glass and called for Pruitt. Doyle Pruitt arrived at Carter's office in 11 minutes. He stood in the doorway and listened while Carter spoke, and the pleasantness drained from his face in increments as the instructions became clear. I want to know everything there is to know about Jake Benton by morning, Carter said. Where he came from, who he worked for, what he owes and who he owes it to. His voice was quiet and without heat, which was more frightening than if he'd been angry. Every man has a pressure point, Doyle. Find his. And if he doesn't have one, Carter looked at him. Every man has one. Some just hide it better. He picked up his glass again. Also, I want the transfer filing expedited. Call in the favor with the county clerk. I want those papers completed and recorded by end of day tomorrow. Pruitt was still. That's a day ahead of schedule. Yes, Carter said. It is. Pruitt left. Carter stood at the window a while longer, and he thought about a widow with $41 and a quiet stranger who asked questions, and the way that morning had felt slightly different from every other morning this week, in the way that weather feels different the hour before a storm. He didn't like the feeling. He set about eliminating it. Jake was back at the inn before 10 o'clock, and he was barely through the door when Mrs. Alcott intercepted him in the hallway with a look on her face that told him immediately that something had shifted. "Man came by asking about you," she said low and quick. "About an hour ago. Didn't give his name. Asked how long you'd paid for whether you'd mentioned any business in town, whether you'd had any visitors." Jake went still. "What did you tell him? That you were a private man and your business was your own?" She held his gaze. "I've lived in this town 22 years, Mr. Benton. I know Thaddeus Carter's men by how they ask questions, like they've already got the right to the answers and they're just waiting for you to confirm it." She crossed her arms. "Whatever you're doing, you'd best do it faster." Jake thanked her and went up the stairs to his room and sat on the bed and thought. The filing was the most urgent thing now. If Carter pushed it through early tomorrow, even then Briggs's testimony and whatever Samuel Pruitt could offer became moot, because there would be nothing left to contest. The property would be recorded as transferred, and reversing a recorded transfer required a judge, a lawyer, and months they didn't have. He needed to get to the county seat himself, not tomorrow, tonight. He sat very still for 3 seconds. Then he stood up, picked up his hat, and went back downstairs. Mrs. Alcott was still in the hallway. "Is there a telegraph office in this town?" he asked. "Closes at 8. What about in Dalton Falls?" "Dalton's 18 miles east. They run late on Wednesday's county business night." She looked at him carefully. "It's past 9. "My horse is fast," Jake said. Something moved in Mrs. Alcott's expression, not quite a smile, but close to the territory. "There's a lawyer in Dalton Falls," she said almost as an afterthought. "Man named Garrison. He's old and half-retired, but he knows every piece of land law in this county from memory, and he has absolutely no love for Thaddeus Carter on account of Carter once bought the note on Garrison's brother's property, and—" She stopped. "Well, that's a long story. The point is, he'd listen." Jake looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Mrs. Alcott squared her shoulders. "Because I have watched that woman Maggie Willard come into this town for 8 months and hold her head up while Carter slowly squeezed everything Thomas left her, and I have watched this town stand by and do nothing because Carter signs their leases and sits on their loan papers and controls who eats well and who doesn't." Her voice was precise and quiet and entirely without self-pity. "And I am tired," she said, "of standing by." Jake held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Alcott," he said, and he meant it all the way down to the floor. He went out to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode east into the dark. He rode hard. The night was warm and clear, the kind of summer night that stretches out flat and wide under a sky crowded with stars, and the road to Dalton Falls was dry and straight, and his horse knew how to move at a full run without asking too many questions. Jake rode and thought and let the speed clear everything non-essential out of his head until what remained was clean and simple. What he knew, what he needed, and what he was going to say when he got there. He reached Dalton Falls at 10:30. The telegraph office was still lit. He sent 2 messages, one to a man he'd worked with in Colfax County, who knew land law the way Jake knew cattle, and one to the territorial court office in Santa Fe, requesting information on whether a loan contract could be challenged on grounds of mental incapacity at time of signing. Then he found the address Mrs. Alcott had given him, and he stood on the porch of a narrow house on the edge of town. And he knocked. The man who opened the door was old late 70s, maybe more, with a white beard and alert eyes, and the look of someone who had been reading and not sleeping because the lamp behind him was bright, and there was a book open on the table and no impression in the armchair cushion. "Mr. Garrison," Jake said. "Who's asking?" The old man's voice was sharp. "My name is Jake Benton. I'm in Millstone Creek on behalf of a widow named Willard, whose farm is being taken by a man named Thaddeus Carter through a loan contract her dying husband signed under circumstances I believe constitute duress." Garrison looked at him through the screen door. The light from inside caught the sharpness in his eyes. "I know the name Carter," the old man said. "Yes, sir. I believe you do." A long pause. The old man looked Jake over from boots to brim. "You'd better come in," Garrison said. "And you'd better start from the beginning." Jake Benton walked through the door and somewhere 18 miles west, in a farmhouse on the edge of a dry cornfield, Maggie Willard lay awake in the dark, with Annie curled against her side, listening to the nothing outside her window, and trying to believe that not saying no had been the bravest thing, and not the most foolish. She didn't know about the ride to Dalton Falls. She didn't know about Garrison or the telegraph, or the messages cutting through the dark toward Santa Fe. What she knew was this Friday was coming like weather, and she had nothing left to fight it with but hope, and hope in her experience was a thin blade against a thing that size. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. Garrison talked until midnight, not the way old men sometimes talk, circling and repeating, losing the thread of their own argument, but with the precise economical delivery of a man who had spent 50 years learning exactly which words mattered and had no patience left for the ones that didn't. He sat across from Jake at the kitchen table, with the copy of Carter's loan language that Jake had reproduced from memory, and he read it with a stillness that reminded Jake of a hawk above an open field, motionless on the surface, everything moving underneath. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked up. "This clause," he said, tapping the secondary party's language with one finger, "is not standard. It's not even close to standard. Carter didn't write this to cover his collateral. He wrote this to own the borrower. Can it be challenged? On incapacity grounds, absolutely. A man running a fever of 103 who reports afterward that he didn't understand what he signed with a doctor willing to testify to both facts. That's not a solid contract. That's a document obtained under conditions that any competent judge would look at sideways." Garrison pulled the paper toward him again. "The question is whether we can get in front of a judge before Carter gets his filing recorded." "He's pushing it through tomorrow," Jake said. Garrison was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood up from the table. "Then we leave at first light," he said. "I'll ride with you to Millstone Creek. I want to speak to this doctor myself." Jake looked at him. "You don't have to do this." The old man gave him a look that was not unkind, but was absolutely without patience for what he'd just heard. "Son," he said, "Thaddeus Carter bought my brother's land out from under him in 1879, using a contract with a forged witness signature, and I have been waiting 4 years for the specific kind of opportunity you just walked through my door with." He moved toward the back of the house. "I'll get my bag. You get some sleep. There's a cot in the second room." Jake did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the cold stove and went over everything he knew and everything he didn't, and sometime after 2 in the morning, he allowed himself to think about what he'd do if it wasn't enough. If Carter's filing went through, if the judge wasn't sympathetic, if Briggs got cold feet, if the whole careful construction he'd been building since Tuesday morning came apart on Thursday afternoon because a man with money and time and a brother-in-law in the right office had simply outmaneuvered him. He thought about Annie's face, the directness of it, the way she'd said, "Okay, Mama," like she was capable of carrying the weight of that word all by herself. He thought about Maggie on the porch step in the last of the daylight, her face open in that unguarded moment, carrying something she'd been carrying alone for a very long time. He thought about Hector's boy in the back of the wagon. Not this time. He didn't sleep. But by the time the sky outside began to lighten, he was ready.
Jealous.
They rode into Millstone Creek at 7:30, and they went straight to Doc Briggs's office, and Garrison spent 45 minutes with the doctor, while Jake stood in the hallway and listened to the low, careful exchange of 2 men building something out of memory and principle, and the accumulated weight of what they'd both witnessed and not acted on until now. When Garrison came out, his expression had not changed. But his eyes were different, sharper, more lit. "He's solid," Garrison said quietly. "His testimony is clean and consistent, and he kept notes. Carter doesn't know about the notes." Jake felt something loosen in his chest. "That's enough. It's enough to file an emergency injunction with the territorial court. If we can get it telegraphed to Santa Fe before Carter's filing is recorded at the county seat." Garrison stopped and looked at Jake directly. "It's a race, son. Nothing more elegant than that. We need to move." They moved. Jake went to the telegraph office. Garrison went with him, and he dictated to the operator with the unhurried precision of a man who had written legal documents in the dark and under pressure, and in circumstances that made this look easy, and the operator's hand moved across the key, and the message went out to Santa Fe, to a territorial court judge Garrison had known for 30 years, requesting an emergency stay of transfer pending incapacity review. It was 8:47 in the morning. They didn't know if it would be enough. They didn't know how fast Carter's filing would move. They didn't know if the judge in Santa Fe would respond in time or at all. What they knew was that they had done everything they could do from this position, and that the next move belonged to the town. Carter knew by 9. He didn't know about Garrison, not yet, but he knew about the telegraph because the operator, a young man named Caldwell, whose uncle worked for Carter's lumber yard, had the particular weakness of people who owe favors to men with long memories. He sent a boy to Carter's office with the message before the ink was dry. Carter read it standing up. Then he called for Pruitt, and when Pruitt came in, Carter said, "Get Benton, now, not the widow, Benton." Pruitt hesitated. "And do what with him?" Carter looked at him. "Talk to him," he said. "You found what I asked you to find?" "Yes, sir." Pruitt's voice was flat. "Took most of the night, but the Bar C ranch in Wyoming, they remember him. He left under specific circumstances." "Tell me." Pruitt told him. Carter listened. And the thing that crossed his face in the listening was not pleasure exactly. It was more like the recognition of a tool that was precisely the right shape for the job at hand. "All right," Carter said. "Bring him in. Tell him I want to talk. Tell him—" He paused. "Tell him it's about the boy." Jake was walking back from the telegraph office when Pruitt found him. Garrison had gone back to Briggs's office to wait for a response from Santa Fe, and Jake was alone on the main street in the full heat of a Thursday morning that felt like a held breath. Pruitt fell into step beside him. Same as before. Close enough to be a message. "Mr. Carter would like a word," Pruitt said. "I'm not interested in words with Mr. Carter. He says it's about a boy named Miguel." "A beat. Hector Vargas's youngest." Jake stopped walking. He stopped completely, and Pruitt stopped too, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the street around them was just the ordinary noise of a Thursday morning, a wagon, a dog, someone calling to someone else across the way, all of it utterly indifferent to the thing that had just happened. Jake's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "What about him?" "Mr. Carter says he's got information about where the Vargas family landed after Wyoming." Pruitt kept his tone careful, professionally neutral. "The boy specifically, whether he's all right." Another beat. Mr. Carter figured that might be a conversation worth having in private. Jake looked at Pruitt for a long time. Then he said, "Lead the way." Carter's office in daylight had the same quality it always had. Orderly, deliberate, everything in its place, the furniture arranged to make the man behind the desk feel larger and the man in front of it feel smaller. Jake walked in and did not let it work on him. He stood in front of the desk and looked at Carter directly and waited. Carter gestured at the chair across from him. "Sit down, Mr. Benton." "I'll stand." Carter studied him a moment, then shrugged, a man unbothered by minor resistances. "Suit yourself." He folded his hands. "I'm going to be direct with you. I respect a man who comes at a problem straight, so I'll do you the same courtesy." "I'd appreciate it," Jake said. "You've been in my town for 4 days. You've spoken to my doctor, my county records office, and apparently an attorney in Dalton Falls, who I'll note was disbarred in 1878 for. He was reinstated in 1881, Jake said. On appeal, you might want to update your information. Carter's jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed. You've also filed, or attempted to file, a legal challenge to a contract that has been in force for 8 months, and that every court in this territory will uphold. He opened a drawer and placed a folded paper on the desk. This is a transfer notice, completed and filed, recorded at the county seat as of, he checked his watch, approximately 30 minutes ago. The room went very still. Jake did not look at the paper. He kept his eyes on Carter. That filing will be contested in territorial court within the hour. On what grounds? Incapacity. The borrower's mental and physical state at time of signing supported by medical testimony and written records. Carter smiled. Dr. Briggs, he said. Yes, I anticipated that might become an issue. He opened another drawer. I have a signed statement from Dr. Briggs dated last December, indicating that he examined Thomas Willard and found him sufficiently lucid to conduct his affairs. He set the paper on the desk. I had the foresight to obtain that documentation when I first anticipated Mrs. Willard might attempt a challenge. Jake looked at the paper. He looked at Carter. That statement, he said, directly contradicts the testimony Dr. Briggs is prepared to give this morning. Then you have a doctor willing to contradict his own signed statement, Carter said pleasantly, which makes him a witness who lacks credibility. Judges tend to notice things like that. He leaned back. You're a smart man, Mr. Benton. Smarter than most who've come through this town with good intentions and a need to fix something. But you've been here 4 days. I've been here 20 years. His voice dropped, not threatening, worse, simply factual. You cannot build in 4 days what I've built in 20 years. And you cannot dismantle in 4 days what I've spent 20 years making sure cannot be dismantled. Jake said nothing. Now, Carter said. He set both hands flat on the desk. Miguel Vargas. 12 years old now, I believe. He and his family settled in Taos after Wyoming. His father, Hector, found work at a sheep ranch outside of town. He paused. Not ideal work, but honest. The family is intact. He held Jake's gaze. I have a contact in Taos who can make that situation considerably less stable if I choose to reach out to him. Another pause. Or I can leave them entirely alone, which is my strong preference, because I am not a cruel man, Mr. Benton. I am simply a man who protects what he's built. The heat in the room was enormous. Outside, the Thursday morning of Millstone Creek went on without them. Jake looked at Thaddeus Carter for a long, measured moment, and he felt every single thing that moment contained: the rage, the recognition, the particular helplessness of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone who had more time and more preparation and less conscience. He felt all of it. And then he made a decision. You're telling me, Jake said slowly, that you'll leave a family in Taos alone if I step back from what I'm doing here. I'm telling you that your involvement has no bearing on what I do in Taos, Carter said carefully. I'm simply noting that I have a contact there and that contacts require management. That's not what you're telling me. Read it however you choose. Jake nodded, slowly. I need to think, he said. Carter looked mildly surprised. He had expected either capitulation or confrontation, and this was neither. Of course, he said. Take the morning, but understand that this is a limited window, Mr. Benton. The filing is done. The property transfers on schedule. The only question is how much disruption precedes the inevitable. He gestured toward the door. I hope you'll choose the simpler path. Jake walked out. He stood in the street, and he breathed, and he did not allow himself to fall apart, which took more effort than anything else he'd done in 4 days. He stood in the heat, and he thought about Hector, and he thought about Miguel, and he thought about Maggie on the porch step, and he thought about what Carter had just done, which was threaten a 12-year-old boy in Taos to leverage a man who hadn't slept in 2 days into walking away from a widow in Millstone Creek. He thought about the kind of world that allowed men like Carter to operate. And he thought about what kind of man he was going to be in that world. He started walking, fast. He found Garrison at Briggs's office. Both men looked up when Jake came through the door, and whatever they saw in his face made them go very still. "Carter filed," Jake said. "He says it's recorded." Garrison set down his coffee. "The injunction request went out 40 minutes ago. He also has a signed statement from Briggs dated December. He's going to use it to undercut your testimony." Briggs stood up from his chair. "That statement was obtained under false pretenses. Carter's man came to me in December and told me it was for Thomas's medical insurance claim. He said it was a standard form. I signed it without reading the full context." His voice cracked with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, but lived between them. "I didn't know he was building a file." Jake looked at him. "Would you say that to a judge?" "I will say exactly that to any judge who will listen." "Good." Jake turned to Garrison. "He also threatened a family in Taos, a man named Vargas. He's trying to use them to get me to back down." Garrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Can he follow through on that threat?" "I don't know. Probably not with anything directly traceable. But he has reach." Jake paused. "I sent a message to Taos this morning before I knew about any of this to a man I trust, asking him to check on the family." "Then that's done," Garrison said. "You can't control what Carter does in Taos. You can control what happens here." He met Jake's eyes. "Are you backing down?" Jake said without hesitation. "No." "Then we have work to do." Maggie found out at 10:30. Ruth Henderson came to the farm, drove herself in her husband's wagon, moving at a speed Ruth Henderson was not known for, and Maggie met her at the gate and knew from Ruth's face before she opened her mouth that something had changed. "Carter filed early," Ruth said. "It's recorded." Maggie felt the words land the way a physical blow lands, not pain first, but impact, the sensation of something hitting, before the mind has time to interpret it. "When?" she said. "This morning, 9 o'clock. Ruth climbed down from the wagon with the quick efficiency of a woman who's decided that moving fast is preferable to standing still. "But Ruth, there's more. That lawyer from Dalton Falls Garrison, he's filed something with the territorial court in Santa Fe. Some kind of order to stop it." "Has it worked?" "We don't know yet." Maggie's jaw tightened. "Where's Jake?" "Last I saw he was walking back from Carter's office, looking like a man who'd been handed something he wasn't expecting." Ruth took her arm. "Maggie, listen to me. The town is talking. People are—" She paused. "I don't know how to say this right, so I'll just say it. People are scared of Carter, but they're more scared of what it means if he wins this. If he takes your farm and sends Annie to the county home, there isn't a family in this valley that doesn't have to look at themselves in the mirror and ask what they allowed." Her voice was steady, but her grip on Maggie's arm was tight. "Ed from the livery talked to his neighbors last night, the Hendersons, the Donahue family east of the creek. They want to help. They don't know how, but they want to." Maggie stared at her. "Ruth, I know. I know you don't want to owe people. I know Thomas raised you both on the idea that you stand on your own 2 feet or you don't stand. But Margaret—" Ruth's voice dropped to something real and direct. "Some things are bigger than pride, and that little girl in there is one of them." Annie appeared in the doorway of the house. She looked at her mother and at Ruth, and she said, "Are they taking the farm today?" Maggie looked at her daughter. She walked to the door, and she crouched down, and she put both hands on Annie's face the way she had in the street 2 days ago, and she said, "Not today. Today we fight." Annie's eyes held hers. "And Mr. Benton?" "He's fighting too." Annie nodded. "Good," she said. "He seems like he's good at it." Jake arrived at the farm at 11 o'clock with Garrison beside him and 2 pieces of information, one of which he told Maggie immediately, and one of which he held back until he could figure out how to say it without breaking something. What he told her Santa Fe had responded. The territorial court had received the injunction request and was reviewing it. They had issued a temporary hold on the transfer recording. Not a reversal, not a ruling, just a hold, which meant Carter's filing, while submitted, was not yet legally finalized. What he held back Carter had also sent a message to Santa Fe. He had reached out to two members of the territorial court who were known to have received business from Carter's banking interests over the years. He had done it within an hour of receiving the injunction request. Garrison had found out through his own contact 40 minutes ago. Carter wasn't fighting them legally. He was going around them. Garrison sat with Maggie at the kitchen table and explained the injunction in plain language, and Maggie listened with the focused stillness she'd used all week. Not calm exactly, but something that looked like calm, because she'd made it look that way by force of will. Annie sat at the table too, and nobody asked her to leave. "So, it's not over," Maggie said when Garrison finished. "No, ma'am, not by a distance. But we bought time." "We bought time," Garrison agreed. "Perhaps a day, perhaps two. It depends entirely on how the court responds and how much weight Carter's relationships carry in Santa Fe." He set his hands flat on the table. "I want you to understand the situation honestly, Mrs. Willard. We have a strong legal argument. We have credible testimony. We have a document obtained under questionable circumstances from a man who is willing to say so in court. That is not nothing, in fact, in a fair proceeding, it's quite a lot." He paused. "Whether the proceeding will be entirely fair is the variable I cannot control for." Maggie looked at him steadily. "What do you need from me?" "I need your strength, ma'am, that's all. I need you to hold on a little longer." She nodded once. "That I can do." Jake was watching her from across the room, and the thing that hit him then, standing in that kitchen with the heat pressing through the windows and the sound of corn moving in a faint hot breeze outside, was that she meant it. She wasn't performing courage. She was the real version, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that keeps going. Not because it believes everything will turn out fine, but because giving up is simply not something it knows how to do. He'd spent 18 months looking for something he hadn't been able to name. He thought, standing in Maggie Willard's kitchen on a Thursday morning in the summer of 1883, that he might have just found it. The afternoon turned. Garrison went back to town to wait for the court response and to make sure their legal position was documented in triplicate. Briggs remained at his office ready. Ruth Henderson, in a move that managed to be both practical and revolutionary, drove to the Donahue farm and then to the Hendersons' place east of the creek, and told both families exactly what was happening and exactly what she thought they should do about it. What she thought they should do was show up, not with weapons, not with threats, just with their bodies and their presence and the knowledge that some things, when enough people witness them, become impossible to hide. Jake stayed at the farm. He told himself he stayed because someone should be with Maggie and Annie in case Carter made a move before the court responded. That was true, but there was another truth underneath it, simpler and harder to say out loud. He didn't want to leave. He and Maggie worked side by side in the afternoon heat fixing the fence gate that had needed a new hinge for months because Maggie said she needed something to do with her hands and Jake said he could use a hammer. Annie helped by handing nails and offering opinions on the quality of their work that were more accurate than encouraging. "That post's still loose," Annie said, watching Jake test the repaired hinge. "It'll hold," Jake said. "Daddy said that about the water barrel and it fell over and flooded the kitchen." Jake tested the post again. "You're right," he said. "It's loose." He set to work on the post. Maggie from the other side of the gate. "She's always right. I just accept that now." "I'm beginning to understand that," Jake said. Annie looked at him with her mother's eyes and her mother's directness and said, "Are you going to stay here in Millstone Creek?" Jake paused. The question sat in the summer air between them, simple and enormous. He looked at Annie. He looked at Maggie, who was watching him with an expression that was very carefully not the same question because she was a woman who wouldn't ask it, not yet, not like this. "I don't have anywhere I need to be," Jake said to Annie. "Let's see how Friday goes." Annie considered this answer with the solemnity it deserved. "Okay," she said. She handed him another nail. Carter came at 4 o'clock. Not with Pruitt, not with his men. He came alone, which was the most unsettling version of Carter there was. Carter without backup was Carter who didn't feel he needed any. He came to the farm. Jake saw him coming up the road from 50 yards and stepped to the edge of the porch and stood there. Behind him, he heard Maggie come through the door and stop. Carter rode to the fence and stopped his horse and looked at Jake. "I thought we were going to have a conversation this morning," Carter said. "We did," Jake said. "I told you I needed to think. I thought. And I'm not backing down." Carter's expression didn't change. He sat very still on his horse, looking at Jake, and then his eyes moved past Jake to Maggie in the doorway, and something passed through them that was harder to read than anything he'd shown so far. "Mrs. Willard," he said with a kind of formal courtesy that was more disturbing than rudeness. "I've tried to handle this matter with respect for your situation. I want you to know that." "You've tried to take my farm and my daughter," Maggie said. Her voice was even. "I know how that is. You can keep your respect." Carter looked at her for a moment. "The court hold is temporary," he said, addressing them both now. "My attorneys in Santa Fe have already filed a response. Within 48 hours, the transfer will be finalized and legally uncontestable." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "I'm giving you this opportunity to come to an arrangement before that happens. An arrangement that allows you to leave Millstone Creek with your dignity and your daughter and a fair sum to begin again elsewhere." "This is her land," Jake said. "The law says otherwise." The law, Jake said, was presented to a dying man who couldn't read straight and told it meant something it doesn't mean. And there is a doctor and a lawyer and a territorial court injunction that are going to say so out loud. Carter looked at him steadily. "And there is a family in Taos," he said quietly, "just for Jake, whose situation remains entirely in my hands." Jake held his gaze. "I sent a letter to Miguel Vargas's father 3 days ago," he said. "Before you mention them, before any of this. Hector will have received it by now. He knows what's happening here. He knows to be watchful." He let that land. "You threaten that family, and the first person who hears about it is a territorial marshal I have known personally for 6 years. Carter went very still. It was the first time in any of their interactions that Jake had seen something in Carter's face that looked genuinely like recalculation. "You're a more prepared man than I gave you credit for," Carter said at last. "I had a good teacher," Jake said. "The hard kind." They looked at each other across the fence line, and for a long moment the whole of Thursday afternoon held its breath. Then Carter gathered his reins. "You should know," he said, and his voice had lost its courteous quality, replaced by something flatter and more honest, "that I have not lost a contested holding in 20 years of doing business in this territory." "Then this'll be new for you," Jake said. Carter looked at him, and then at Maggie, and then he turned his horse and rode back toward town without another word. Jake watched him go. Behind him, he heard Maggie exhale long and slow, like a woman who has been holding her breath for a very long time. "Did that just happen?" she said. "It happened," Jake said. "Did we just—" "Not yet," he said. He turned to look at her. "But we're close. We're real close, Maggie." It was the first time he'd used her name. She heard it. Her eyes met his, and something shifted in them. Not romantic, not yet. Not with everything still balanced on the edge of a territorial court ruling, and a man who had 20 years of practice at winning, but real. The kind of shift that happens when two people stop being strangers in the middle of a crisis, and become something that doesn't have a name yet, but knows its own weight. "Stay for supper," she said. Jake Benton nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And 3 miles away in his office, Thaddeus Carter sat at his desk and looked at the message he'd just received from his attorney in Santa Fe, and read it twice, and felt the first real cold edge of something he had not felt in 20 years of winning. The judge reviewing the injunction was not one of his. It was Garrison's. And Garrison's judge had just issued a full stay of transfer pending an emergency evidentiary hearing, not in 48 hours, not next week. Tomorrow morning. Friday had just become something neither side had planned for. The supper was beans and cornbread, and not enough of either. And it was the best meal Jake Benton had eaten in 18 months. Not because of the food, because of the table. Annie sat across from him and ate with the particular efficiency of a child who had learned not to waste anything. And she talked about the corn, about the 3 chickens by name, about a book her father had read to her that she could now read herself. And the talking filled the kitchen with something Jake hadn't been around in a long time, which was the sound of a life being lived rather than survived. Maggie moved between the stove and the table, and said little, but her face in those moments was different from any version of her face he'd seen in 3 days. Quieter, less braced. He helped wash the dishes after. Maggie didn't tell him to. She also didn't tell him not to. "The hearing is at 8, she said, handing him a plate to dry. "Garrison will be there by 7, so will Briggs. And Carter's lawyers." "Carter always has lawyers," Jake said. "That's not the same as being right." Maggie was quiet for a moment, working the soapy water around the bottom of a pot. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said, about Hector." He waited. "You wrote to him before Carter mentioned him," she said. "Before any of this, you said." "Yes." "Why?" He set the dried plate on the shelf. "Because he deserved to know someone was still thinking about him," he said. "And because I wasn't sure I was going to come out the other side of this week looking like myself, and I wanted to have done at least one thing right before—" He stopped. Maggie turned from the sink and looked at him. He met her eyes. "Before it got complicated," he finished. She held his gaze for a moment that was longer than the ordinary kind. Then she turned back to the pot. "You're a strange man, Jake Benton," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I mean that as a compliment." "I know," he said. "I took it that way." Annie's voice came from the back room where she'd been sent to wash up. "Are you two still talking about the hearing?" "Go to sleep, Annie," Maggie called back. "I'm just asking." "I know what you're asking." Sleep. A silence. Then, "Good night, Mr. Benton?" Jake looked at the doorway. Something moved in his chest, the way things move when they've been still too long, and someone walks by close enough to shift the air. "Good night, Annie," he said. He left shortly after. He rode back to town in the dark, and he did not let himself think about Friday with anything other than clarity, because clarity was what the next 12 hours required, and everything else could wait. Carter did not sleep either. He sat in his office with the message from Santa Fe on the desk in front of him and thought through every angle the way he always did when a situation was not going the way he'd built it to go, which in 20 years had not happened often. The judge was Garrison's. The evidentiary hearing was real. His own attorneys had already sent a response to Santa Fe, but they'd sent it assuming a friendly court, and a Garrison judge was not a friendly court. What he had was the signed statement from Briggs. What he had was a contract with Thomas Willard's signature on it. What he had was 20 years of presence and investment and influence in this territory. And none of that disappeared because some drifter from Wyoming decided to play hero for a widow. What he had, he reminded himself, was the filing. Already submitted. Already in the record. A temporary stay was not a reversal. It was a pause. And pauses could be waited out by men who had patience and resources. He had both. He called for Pruitt. When Pruitt arrived, Carter said, "I need our attorneys in that courtroom by 7:30. I need the Briggs statement certified and notarized by tonight. And I need someone at the telegraph office to make sure nothing further goes out to Santa Fe without my knowing." Pruitt said, and Benton Carter looked at him. "Benton is not our problem anymore," he said. "The law is our problem. And I know the law." Pruitt left. Carter turned to the window. He told himself he was not worried. He was almost right. Friday arrived without ceremony. The sky went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a summer morning that didn't know yet how hot it intended to get. Maggie was up before it dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas's tin box open in front of her and the loan papers flat on the wood, reading them the way she'd read them 100 times in 8 months, not hoping to find something new, just reminding herself of exactly what had been done to them and exactly why today mattered. Annie came out of the bedroom already dressed. "I want to come," she said. Maggie looked at her. "To the hearing," Annie said. "I want to come." "It's not a place for children." "It's about our farm," Annie said. "And you said yesterday we fight." She held her mother's gaze with a steadiness that was Thomas around the eyes and Maggie everywhere else. "I want to fight too." Maggie looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Stay beside me," she said. "Don't speak unless spoken to, and if it gets loud—" "I won't cover my ears," Annie said with great dignity. Maggie almost smiled. "No," she agreed. "I don't reckon you will." They reached Millstone Creek at 7:15 and found it already different. Maggie felt it before she saw the cause of it, a difference in the air, in the weight of the morning, in the way the street felt when she turned onto it. Denser somehow. More populated than a Friday morning had any reason to be. The Donahue family was there. Ed from the livery, the woman from the laundry whose name was Clara, who Maggie had spoken to maybe 4 times in 6 years. The Henderson family, Bill and Ruth both standing in front of the building that served Millstone Creek as a courthouse on the rare occasions it was needed, which was a repurposed meeting hall with 2 narrow windows and benches that had been borrowed from the church, and others. People Maggie knew by face and not name. Families from the Eastern Valley. A man she recognized from the mill. They weren't carrying signs. They weren't making noise. They were simply there, standing in the morning heat with the particular quiet determination of people who had decided that standing still was no longer something they were willing to do. Ruth Henderson saw Maggie coming and crossed to her immediately. "Garrison's inside," she said. "Briggs is with him. The judge came in on last night's coach from Dalton Falls. Garrison's man confirmed." She squeezed Maggie's arm. "The room is full, Margaret. People came." Maggie looked at the crowd. She felt something press hard against the inside of her chest. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Carter holds paper on half these families." Ruth looked at her steadily. "That," she said, "is exactly why." Inside the room was close and warm and already charged with the specific tension of a space where something real was about to be decided. 2 long tables faced the raised platform, where Judge Harold Yates' 62 wire spectacles, the particular bearing of a man who had seen enough foolishness in courtrooms to be entirely immune to theatrical performances, sat reviewing documents with the focused indifference of a man who had a job and intended to do it. Carter's attorneys occupied the right table. 2 of them from Dalton Falls, polished pressed, carrying the confident ease of men accustomed to winning before the arguments began. Carter himself sat behind them in the front row, straight-backed, composed, his expression giving nothing. Garrison sat at the left table with Briggs beside him. Jake was already there, and when Maggie walked in, he turned and found her immediately the way people do when they've been tracking a sound they've been waiting for. He stood. He gestured to the chair beside him. Maggie sat. Annie sat beside her. Jake did not comment on Annie's presence. "How does it look?" Maggie said low. "Garrison thinks we have a real argument," Jake said. "Briggs is solid. The question is whether Carter's statement holds up under examination." He paused. "Carter's attorneys are good." "So is Garrison." "Yes," Jake said. "He is." Maggie looked across the room at Carter, who had not looked at her. She looked at the back of his neck, the precise set of his shoulders, and she thought about Thomas signing those papers in a fever sweat, trying to protect his family, believing the man across from him was trustworthy. She thought about 8 months of trying to hold together what Thomas had left. She thought about Annie saying, "I want to fight too." "Let's begin," Judge Yates said. Garrison was methodical and unhurried, and he laid out the incapacity argument with the calm precision of a man building a structure that was meant to last. He cited the date of signing the documented fever, the medication Briggs had administered 2 hours prior, the pattern of Thomas's post-signing confusion. He presented Briggs's notes, actual handwritten notes from the day of the visit, which Carter's attorneys clearly had not expected, because the younger of the two leaned to the other and said something sharp and low. Carter's attorney rose when Garrison finished and produced the signed December statement. "Dr. Briggs," he said pleasantly, "you signed this document indicating that Thomas Willard was, and I quote, in sufficient command of his faculties to conduct his personal affairs. Is that your signature, sir?" Briggs looked at the paper. "Yes." "And you signed it willingly under no duress?" "I signed it," Briggs said, "believing it was documentation for a life insurance claim. I was told by the man who brought it to me that it was a standard medical form for the purposes of the Willard estate settlement." He paused. "I was not told it would be used in a contract dispute. I was not told it would be used to contradict my own clinical observations." His voice was steady and heavy with something that had been building for 8 months. "Had I understood its purpose, I would not have signed it." The room stirred. Carter's attorney kept his composure. "Dr. Briggs, you're now claiming that a document bearing your signature was obtained fraudulently. That's a significant allegation." "Yes," Briggs said. "It is." "Can you prove the misrepresentation?" "The man who brought me that document," Briggs said, "was Doyle Pruitt. He told me in the presence of my receptionist, Mrs. Clara Holt, who is present in this room today, that it was an insurance form." He looked at the judge. "Mrs. Holt remembers the conversation. She will say so, if asked." From the back of the room, Clara Holt, the woman from the laundry, said clearly, "I will." Judge Yates looked up from his papers. Carter's attorney said sharply, "This is not a forum for audience participation." "No," Judge Yates said, "but it is a forum for relevant testimony, and I'll hear what I choose to hear." He looked at Clara Holt. "Ma'am, you heard the exchange between Dr. Briggs and the man who brought the document." "Yes, Your Honor. He said it was for insurance purposes. He said it was routine." The room was very quiet. Carter's attorney pivoted. "Even granting the doctor's characterization," he said, "the contract itself remains valid. The signature is Thomas Willard's. The debt is documented. The terms, Garrison said, rising, include a clause designating the borrower's family members as secondary collateral, a clause that was not explained to Mr. Willard, and that does not appear in any standard loan instrument in this territory." He set a file on the table. "I have here 17 loan contracts issued by Mr. Carter's business over the past 12 years. In none of them, none does this specific language appear. It was written into the Willard contract alone." He looked at the judge. "That is not standard practice. That is a constructed trap." The room erupted. Not loudly, more like a single collective exhale of something that had been held in for a long time. Carter for the first time shifted in his chair. Judge Yates called for quiet. He got it. He looked at the documents in front of him for a long time, and the room held its breath, and nobody moved. Then he said, "I want to see all 17 contracts in evidence. I want Dr. Briggs' original clinical notes entered into the record. And I want Mr. Carter's counsel to explain to me specifically the legal basis for the secondary parties clause in plain language." He set down his pen. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." In the hallway, Jake found Maggie standing with her back against the wall and Annie's hand in both of hers, and he stopped in front of her and said, "How are you holding?" "Tell me honestly," she said. "How is it going?" "Garrison has him on the clause," Jake said. "The judge is paying attention. Real attention. The kind where a man has already started deciding something and is looking for confirmation." He held her gaze. "It's not over. But we're in front." Maggie's jaw tightened. "Carter won't go quiet." "No," Jake agreed. "He won't." And he was right, because when the recess ended and the room reconvened, Carter's senior attorney stood and introduced something that had not been mentioned before: a letter submitted to the court from a business partner of Thomas Willard's, a man named Garrett Cole from Dalton Falls, stating that Thomas had discussed the loan terms with him prior to signing and had expressed understanding of all clauses, including the secondary party's language. Garrison looked at it. Jake looked at it. Maggie felt the floor of her certainty shift under her. "When was this letter written?" Garrison asked. 3 days ago, the attorney said. 3 days ago, Garrison repeated, after the injunction was filed, after Mr. Carter became aware of our legal challenge. He looked at the judge. This letter was produced specifically for this hearing. It is a contemporaneous recollection. It is a document created to order, Garrison said flatly. Your Honor, I would ask that the court consider the circumstances of its production. Judge Yates took the letter. He read it. He set it down. Does anyone present know a man named Garrett Cole? He said. Silence. Then Ruth Henderson's voice from the third row. Garrett Cole sold his business in Dalton Falls in 1881 and moved to Denver. He's been there 2 years. I know his wife's sister. She paused. I'd be surprised if he set foot in Millstone Creek more than twice in his life. Carter's attorney was on his feet. Your Honor, this woman has no standing in this territory. Judge Yates said with a quietness that silenced the room completely. I decide what standing is. He looked at Carter's attorney, then at Carter himself for a long, deliberate moment. I will not comment on the provenance of this letter, but I will note for the record that its timing is irregular. Its witness is absent and unverifiable, and its content is not corroborated by any independent source. He set it aside. It will not be entered into evidence. Carter said nothing, but his hands flat on the table in front of him pressed down harder. The moment the hearing broke, not with a final ruling, Judge Yates explained carefully, but with a determination that the stay would be extended, pending full review of all 17 contracts and a formal incapacity assessment. The room moved like water that had been dammed too long. People came to Maggie, not all at once, not in a rush, but in the steady, purposeful way of people who have been working up to something and have finally arrived at it. The Donahue man shook her hand and said that if she needed labor through the harvest, his boys were available. Clara Holt from the laundry said she'd meant to say something for months and was sorry she'd waited this long. Ed from the livery said Carter held the note on his building, but he wanted Maggie to know that if anything needed hauling, he'd do it without a bill. Annie stood beside Maggie and watched all of this with enormous eyes. Ruth Henderson appeared at Jake's elbow while Maggie was surrounded, and she said very quietly, That was well done, Mr. Benton. Garrison did the work, Jake said. Garrison wouldn't be here without you, Ruth said. Don't be modest. It doesn't suit a man who rode 18 miles in the dark. Jake watched Maggie across the room. The set of her shoulders finally different, finally something other than braced, and he said, She'd have found a way without me. Ruth considered this. Maybe, she said, but she didn't have to. She looked at him sideways. You planning to stay in Millstone Creek? Jake was quiet. I haven't decided, he said. Ruth said. She patted his arm with the authority of a woman who had already decided for him. You might want to think fast. Winter comes quick out here, and a farm that size needs more than one pair of hands through the cold months. She walked away before he could respond. Across the room, Maggie looked up and found his eyes, and in the brief, unguarded moment before she looked away, Jake saw something that hadn't been there 4 days ago, when she'd stood at the gate with a hoe in her hand and studied him like a problem she wasn't sure she could afford. It was something small and careful and very real, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Carter left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. He walked to his office with Pruitt beside him, and he sat at his desk, and he did not look at the window this time. He sat with his hands still and his face composed, and he thought about what had just happened in a room full of people who were supposed to stay in their places, and had instead chosen one by one to step out of them. He had not lost, not yet. The ruling was a continuation, not a reversal. The full review would take time, and time, in his experience, was still something he could work with. But the room had been full of people. That was the part that he couldn't calculate around. Not the legal argument, not Garrison's documents, not even the judge. The people. Their presence. The woman from the laundry speaking up from the third row. The liveryman offering labor without a bill. Carter had built his position in Millstone Creek on the assumption that people, when sufficiently pressured and sufficiently afraid, would stay quiet. Doyle Pruitt said, "What now?" Carter looked at him. He had built this town. He had invested in it, financed it, shaped its commerce and its infrastructure and its social order for 20 years. And he had done it, he had told himself, because it was good business, because it was what a man of means and vision did with his advantages. But in the quiet of his office, on a Friday morning, with the sound of people talking outside his window, talking in the way people talk when they've done something together that they intend to keep doing, Thaddeus Carter sat with the first honest question he'd asked himself in a very long time. What had he actually built? He didn't answer it out loud. "We wait for the full review," he told Pruitt. "We cooperate with the court. We do not make any further moves against the Willard property." Pruitt stared at him. "Sir, you heard me." A long pause. "The 17 contracts will be reviewed," Carter said, "which means every one of them needs to be examined by our attorneys before the court examines them." His voice was measured and flat. "Begin today." Pruitt left. Carter sat alone in the office he had built and looked at nothing and thought about the particular wait of 20 years and what it looked like when the thing you had built turned its face toward you in the light. Jake found Maggie sitting on the bench outside the courthouse an hour after the hearing ended. Annie curled against her side, asleep in the way children sleep when they've been holding themselves awake past their limit completely, with the absolute surrender of a body that has decided the crisis is over. He sat beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be there. "She crashed fast," he said. "She always does." Maggie looked at her daughter's sleeping face with an expression that was too large for any single word. She was so brave today. "She was," Jake agreed. "She gets it from her mother." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's not over. No. The full review could take weeks. Carter's attorneys will make it last as long as they can." "Yes," Jake said. "They will. And we don't know what the review finds." "We know what it should find," Jake said. "Garrison knows how to make sure it finds the right thing." Maggie looked at him. Really looked at him the way she had on the porch step in the last of Thursday's light, without the armor she usually kept in place. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask it. Are you staying?" Her voice was level. She asked it the way she asked important things directly, without softening it into something easier to refuse. "Not because of the case, not because there's still work to do." She held his gaze. "Because you want to." Jake Benton sat in the summer heat of Millstone Creek with a sleeping child 3 feet away and a woman beside him who had spent 4 days showing him what it looked like to be made of something real, and he thought about 18 months of riding south and everything he'd been riding from, and the moment he'd stood in the shadow of a building and watched her walk away with her back straight and her head high. "Yes," he said. "I'm staying because I want to." Maggie held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked away back at Annie, and something settled in her face that had been unsettled for a very long time. "All right," she said softly. "Then let's go home." The drive back to the farm was quiet, in the way that only comes after a thing has broken open and not yet healed, closed. Not an empty quiet, but a full one, carrying everything that had happened and hadn't yet been said. Annie woke up halfway home disoriented and soft-edged with sleep, and looked around at the road and the fields, and Jake riding alongside the wagon on his dark horse, and she said, "Did we win?" Maggie kept her eyes on the road ahead. "We held," she said. "That's enough for today." Annie thought about this. "Is Mr. Benton coming to the farm? He's riding alongside us, isn't he?" Annie looked at Jake. Jake looked back at her. "You can stop at the farm," Annie told him with the authority of a 7-year-old who has decided a thing. "Mama makes good biscuits on Saturdays." "Annie," Maggie said, "it's true." Jake kept his face straight. "I'd be honored," he said. Maggie did not say anything. But the line of her shoulders eased a fraction, and that was its own kind of answer. Yes. The weeks that followed moved with the slow grinding rhythm of legal processes, which is to say they moved like a wagon through deep mud forward, but at a cost, and with a great deal of effort expended for very small distances. Garrison drove the review from his end, making the trip from Dalton Falls twice a week, with a reliability that impressed everyone and surprised no one who knew him. The territorial court assigned a second judge to assist a woman named Porter, which was itself a thing Millstone Creek talked about for days, and together they worked through Carter's 17 contracts with the thoroughness of people who had been handed a gift and intended to use it properly. What they found over the course of 3 weeks was a pattern. Not every contract was fraudulent. Carter was too careful for that. But 8 of the 17 contained language that did not appear in standard instruments, and 3 of them had signatures obtained under circumstances that raised the same questions as Thomas Willard's. One contract signed by a farmer named Donahue in 1880 had a witness signature that belonged to a man who had died 6 months before the document was dated. That was the one that changed everything. Jake heard about the Donahue contract on a Tuesday morning from Garrison himself, who rode out to the farm specifically to deliver the news. Jake was fixing the roof of the smaller barn when Garrison's horse came through the gate, and he climbed down and waited while the old lawyer swung down with the careful deliberateness of a man his age who has learned not to hurry dismounts. "The forged witness," Garrison said without preamble, "is enough for criminal fraud charges, not civil, criminal." He let that land. "The territorial prosecutor in Santa Fe has been notified. He'll be in Millstone Creek by Thursday." Jake was very still. "And the Willard contract?" "The Willard contract is being vacated, fully." The incapacity argument alone was sufficient, but with the pattern evidence. Garrison shook his head. "Carter's attorneys have already contacted the court to discuss terms." Jake said, "Terms meaning?" "Meaning Carter is trying to negotiate his way out of criminal proceedings by agreeing to dissolve the contested contracts and make restitution." Garrison looked at Jake steadily. "He may succeed. A man with his resources and his lawyers and his 20 years of goodwill deposited in the right places, he may walk away without a conviction." His voice was measured neither bitter nor forgiving. "But the Willard farm is Maggie's. That is no longer in question. That is done." Jake looked at the barn. He looked at the gate. He looked at the dry summer land that Thomas Willard had worked for 6 years, and Maggie Willard had held together for 8 months with $41 and whatever was left of her will. "Does she know?" he said. "Not yet," Garrison said. "I came to you first." He gave Jake a look that was very old and very wise and entirely without apology. "Thought you'd want to be the one." He found Maggie in the corn. She was working the rows the way she worked them every morning, steady and focused, and she heard him coming and straightened, but didn't turn, because she'd learned the sound of his boots on dry ground in the past 3 weeks, the way you learn a sound that comes often enough to become part of the pattern of your days. "Garrison's here," he said. She turned then. She read his face. And before he'd said a single word of what Garrison had told him, something shifted in her expression. Not relief, yet because she'd learned not to reach for relief before the words arrived, but the very beginning of it, the leading edge. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She stood in the middle of her corn, and she listened, and she did not cry, which did not surprise him, and she did not say anything for a long time after he finished, which also did not surprise him. She looked past him at the sky, which was the particular blue of a summer that had nearly finished, and she breathed slow and even, and he watched her absorb it the way she absorbed everything, without drama, without collapse from the inside out. Then she said, "It's ours." "It's yours," Jake said. "It's always been yours." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright but steady. Thomas would have... She stopped, started again. He would have liked knowing that someone made it right. Her voice held the fullness of a woman who carries her dead well, not dragging them, but not putting them down either. He would have thanked you. He'd have no reason to, Jake said. You did the hard part. You held it together long enough for the rest of it to matter. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. The corn stood around them in the last of the summer heat, and somewhere in the house Annie was singing something slightly off-key and entirely without self-consciousness. Jake, Maggie said. Yes. I'm going to say something and I need you to let me say it without interrupting. He waited. I have been alone for 8 months, she said. And before that, I was married to a good man who I loved and who is gone, and I did not think I was not looking for... She stopped, gathered herself. You came here as a stranger, and you stayed as something else, and I don't have a clean word for what that something else is, but it has been the difference this month between going under and staying above water. Her voice was direct and quiet, and entirely without performance. I am not saying that as a debt. I am saying it as a fact. Because I'm a woman who believes in saying facts out loud. Jake held her gaze. There's a fact I'd like to say in return, he said. Go ahead. I came into this town 4 days behind where I needed to be, and I spent 18 months before that going in the wrong direction. He paused. I think the right direction was here. I think it has been for a while. Another pause, careful and deliberate. I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. Annie's singing stopped. They both looked toward the house. Annie was standing in the doorway, watching them with the expression of a child who has been paying more attention than the adults realized. I already said he should stay, Annie called across the field. I said that days ago. Maggie's face broke into something real and unguarded, and completely itself. Not a polite smile, not the composed expression she wore in Carter's office, or the courthouse, or any of the places where she needed to look like nothing could touch her. Just Maggie Willard, in her own corn on her own land, laughing with her whole chest. Yes, she said to Jake. We'll have you. The prosecutor arrived on Thursday. His name was Arthur Meade, and he was 38 years old and thorough in the way that made Carter's attorneys visibly uncomfortable within the first hour of his arrival. He set up at the courthouse the repurposed meeting hall with the borrowed church benches, and he spent 2 days interviewing every person in Millstone Creek who had ever signed a document with Carter's name on it. On the second day, Doyle Pruitt came to see him voluntarily. Nobody expected that. Not Garrison, not Meade himself, and certainly not Thaddeus Carter, who found out about it from a boy who'd overheard it at the telegraph office and ran to Carter's office with the news the way people run when they're carrying something they know is going to land hard. Pruitt had been with Carter for 11 years. He'd carried the papers, managed the intimidation, delivered the messages fetched and carried and arranged, and looked the other way. And on the second day of Arthur Meade's visit to Millstone Creek, he walked into the courthouse and sat down across from the prosecutor and said he'd like to talk about the forged witness signature on the Donahue contract. He knew who had signed it. It wasn't Carter. It was him, and he'd signed it because Carter had told him it was a copy that the original had been misplaced, and the witness was unavailable, but had confirmed his participation, and Pruitt had believed him, or told himself he believed him, which was not the same thing. And he'd known for 4 years that what he'd done was wrong, and he had not slept cleanly in 4 years. He said all of this to Arthur Meade in a flat, tired voice, and when he finished, the prosecutor said, Mr. Pruitt, I need you to understand the implications of this statement. I understand them, Pruitt said. You could be charged. I know. He looked at his hands. I know that. He was quiet for a moment. But Carter told me it was a copy. I signed it and he used it, and I let that happen. And for 4 years, I've been watching him do what he does with other people's property, and I've been... He stopped. I need to sleep, he said. That's all. I just need to sleep. Meade looked at him for a long time. All right, he said. Let's start from the beginning. Carter did not fight it. That was the thing nobody fully anticipated. Not the dramatic last stand, not the courtroom battle with teams of attorneys and appeals and delays stretching into years. Carter looked at what Pruitt's testimony meant alongside everything Garrison had assembled, and he did the calculation the way he always did calculations, with cold clarity and no sentiment attached. And he reached a conclusion. He settled. Full vacation of the Willard contract and deed transfer. Restitution payments to the Donahue family and 2 others. A formal agreement to sell his interest in 4 properties he'd acquired through the contested contracts. No criminal prosecution in exchange for full cooperation with the territorial court review. He did not admit wrongdoing. He never admitted wrongdoing, but Millstone Creek knew. Every family that had signed a paper in Carter's office and felt something not quite right about it knew. Every person who had watched Maggie Willard walk into that courthouse with her daughter and her straight spine knew. The settlement said nothing. The town said everything. Carter left Millstone Creek on a Saturday in late August, which was 4 weeks after Jake Benton had ridden through the gate with the red rag on the post, and he left quietly, the way men leave when the ground they built on has stopped holding their weight. He took his furniture and his records and the gold-lettered sign from above his office door, and he drove out of town without stopping, and Millstone Creek watched him go without ceremony. Ruth Henderson, standing on the boardwalk with her husband's hand in hers, said, "Good riddance." Bill Henderson said, 20 years. 20 years, Ruth agreed. And it took a widow and a drifter 4 days to undo it. She shook her head, but not with sadness. Imagine what they'll build in 20. The deed arrived on a Monday. Garrison brought it himself, rode out to the farm in the early morning when the summer was finally beginning to relent, and the air carried the faint, distant suggestion of autumn coming in from the north. Maggie was at the table when he knocked. Jake was in the barn. Annie was in the yard doing something that involved a great deal of concentration and one of the chickens. Garrison sat down and opened his case and produced a single document and set it flat on the table. Maggie looked at it. Her name. The property description. The territorial seal. All of it clean and unambiguous and final. She put her hand flat on the paper and held it there for a long moment, without speaking. Garrison said gently, "It's done, Mrs. Willard." "Maggie," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Please, just Maggie." He smiled. "It's done, Maggie." She nodded. She took her hand off the paper and folded it carefully along its original creases and walked to the shelf above the door and opened Thomas's tin box and placed the deed inside on top of the old loan agreement that would never be used again. She closed the box. Then she walked to the door and called out, "Jake!" He came out of the barn. He looked at her face, and he knew. She held up the tin box. Just that. Just held it up in the morning light in the doorway of the house that was hers. Jake walked across the yard and stopped in front of her and looked at her holding that box, and he said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and sometimes the most important moments of a person's life are the ones that don't require language. Annie appeared from the side of the house with the chicken under her arm and assessed the situation with 7-year-old directness. "Does this mean we can fix the water barrel now?" she said. "The one Daddy said would hold." Maggie laughed. The real kind, the full chest kind. The kind Jake had heard that day in the corn and had been carrying around ever since. "Yes," she said. "We'll fix the water barrel." The twist that Millstone Creek had not seen coming arrived at the end of August, not with drama, but with a letter. It came from Taos, from Hector Vargas. Jake had been expecting it. He'd written to Hector the first week, and then again after Carter's settlement, and he'd told Maggie about all of it, every word. But the letter that arrived was not addressed to Jake. It was addressed to Maggie. She read it at the kitchen table with Jake across from her and Annie asleep in the back room, and the first cool evening of the turning season coming through the window. She read it slowly, and her face changed as she read, moving through something complicated. Hector Vargas had written to thank her. Not for anything she'd done directly, but because Jake's letter, The first one, the one Jake had sent before he even knew if any of this would work, had reached Hector at the moment his own situation in Taos was in danger. A man there, a property owner with similar methods to Carter, had been moving against the sheep ranch where Hector worked using the same kinds of papers and the same kinds of pressure. Jake's letter had warned him. Hector had gone to a lawyer in Taos with the letter as evidence of a pattern, and the case against the property owner had been opened. Miguel, Hector wrote, was well. He was 12 now, and tall, and learning to read. He had asked his father to tell the people in Millstone Creek, "Thank you." Maggie set the letter down. She looked at Jake. "You didn't tell me about this part," she said. "I didn't know about this part," he said honestly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "One man making one decision in one town, and it reached all the way to Taos." She looked at the letter. "Thomas used to say that you can't ever see where the good goes. You just do it and trust it goes somewhere." Jake looked at her. He was right. He usually was, she said. About the important things. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the tin box with the deed and the old loan papers, all of it together, all of what that summer had cost, and given back, and built in its wake. They were married in October, when the heat had finally let go its grip on Millstone Creek, and the air had turned clean and honest, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold. It was not a large wedding. It was not a ceremony full of speeches or the kinds of formal declarations that required many words. Garrison came down from Dalton Falls. The Hendersons were there. Doc Briggs. Ed from the livery. Clara from the laundry. A dozen families from the valley who had spent August watching what one woman's refusal to give up and one man's refusal to ride away had done to a town that had forgotten what it was capable of. Annie stood beside Maggie in a dress Ruth Henderson had made, and she held the tin box because Maggie had asked her to, and because Annie took the responsibility of holding important things with the seriousness it deserved. When it was done, when the words had been said and the papers signed, and the thing was real in the way that only real things become, Annie looked up at Jake and said, "You fixed the water barrel." "I did," Jake said. "And the fence gate." "And the fence gate." Annie considered the totality of his contributions with the gravity of a 7-year-old completing an audit. "Okay," she said. She put her hand in his. "You can stay." Jake Benton looked down at Annie Willard's hand in his, and then at Maggie. Now, Maggie Benton standing in the October light with her face open and unheld and entirely herself. And he thought about 18 months of riding south looking for the place where he could stop looking, and about a gate with a red rag on the post and a woman standing in a cornfield who hadn't said yes and hadn't said no, and had somehow been both at once. He thought about what it meant to stop being a man who rode away. The town of Millstone Creek came out of that summer, changed in ways that don't always show in the obvious places, not in the buildings or the roads or the names on the storefronts, but in the way its people looked at each other when things got hard, remembering what they had done when one of their own had nothing left but $41 and a child who didn't ask questions and a spine that refused to bend. They remembered what it looked like to stand up. And on the Benton farm 2 miles east of town through that October and the winter that followed and all the seasons that came after the water barrel held, the fence gate swung clean and true on its new hinge. And every morning without exception, a man who had spent 18 months riding away from himself woke up in a life he had chosen beside a woman who had taught him that the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to let go of what belongs to them, and knew with the full, settled certainty of a man who has finally stopped moving that he was exactly where he was supposed to be.